The corn was dead by the 4th of July. Not dying, dead. The kind of dead that didn't leave room for argument or optimism or even grief, just the plain hard fact of it. The way a fence post that's finally rotted through doesn't lean anymore. It just falls. By the time the firecrackers were popping up and down Main Street in Harlan Creek, Kansas, and the volunteer fire department was setting off their annual bottle rockets from the courthouse lawn, Silas Holt had already walked his east fields twice in the early morning dark, running his thumbnails along the silks of his corn ears and finding nothing but dry paper husks where the milk should have been swelling. He'd looked at the sky in the way his father had taught him to look at it, reading it the way other men read newspapers, searching for the particular layering of clouds that meant rain was thinking about coming. There was nothing up there but a flat white-blue haze, the kind that sits over the southern Kansas plains like a lid on a canning jar and just bakes everything underneath. Silas Holt was 70 years old that summer, though most people in Meade County would have guessed older, because the sun and the wind and 60 years of hard physical work had done to his face what they do to good leather left out in the weather, cured it, darkened it, cut it with lines that told a story if you knew how to read them. He stood 6'1" in his work boots, not quite as straight as he'd once stood, but close enough that it still surprised people when he drew himself all the way up. His hands were the most remarkable thing about him, if you noticed hands, which most people nowadays didn't bother to. They were enormous, rope-veined, permanently darkened at the knuckles, with the kind of quiet capability in them that comes only from a lifetime of real work. Not the gym variety, but the kind where you're pulling something that genuinely resists being pulled, fixing something that genuinely doesn't want to be fixed, coaxing life out of ground that would just as soon give up and die. He had been farming this particular patch of southwestern Kansas since 1948, when he came back from the Pacific with a Purple Heart he kept in a coffee can under the workbench, a wife named Lorena who had waited for him with the kind of steadfast patience that would embarrass most modern people to contemplate, and a deep certainty that the only life he wanted was the one his father and his grandfather had lived on this same quarter section of hard red ground. His father, Dutch Holt, had broken this ground in 1919 with a team of Belgian draft horses named Jasper and King. His grandfather, August Holt, had come up from Missouri in 1897 with a wagon, a milk cow, and a set of brass dowsing rods that had belonged to his own father before him, a man who had learned the water-finding art somewhere in the hill country of Pennsylvania, where the old knowledge ran deep in the families that had been there since before the Revolution. Those rods were hanging on 2 finishing nails inside the door of Silas's equipment shed, right where his grandfather had put them. Silas had not touched them in 11 years. The last time he'd used them was in 1969, when a neighbor's well had gone dry and the neighbor, a young man newly arrived from Wichita who'd bought old Ed Carpenter's place and thought he was going to raise quarter horses, had called in a drilling company from Liberal that had sunk 3 holes and come up dry on all of them. Silas had walked the man's property on a Wednesday morning in May and found him a vein in 40 minutes, and the drilling company, embarrassed and skeptical, had drilled where Silas pointed anyway because they were out of ideas. They'd hit water at 62 feet. Silas had driven home, hung the rods back on their nails, and not spoken about it since. He was not a man who spoke about things unnecessarily. That was the essential fact about Silas Holt. His silence was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say, but the silence of a man who had learned early that most of what people said was a form of noise, and noise was something you made when you were nervous about the quiet. His father had been the same way. Dutch Holt could go all day in the fields without saying a word, and at the supper table he'd say what needed saying in 4 or 5 sentences, and that would be enough. Silas had taken it further. He'd been known to go 2 full days without speaking to anyone, not from antisocial tendencies, but simply because no words were required. Lorena had understood this perfectly. In 41 years of marriage, she had never once tried to fill his silences, which was one of the reasons those 41 years had been good ones. Lorena had been gone for 3 years now. Cancer, quick and merciless, the way things that are going to kill you have no obligation to be slow about it. Their son, Robert, had come back from Denver for the funeral and then gone back to Denver again, where he worked for an engineering firm and lived in a condominium and had 2 children who had never fed a calf or shoveled a stall or felt the particular satisfaction of finding the first edible ears on a stand of corn you'd planted yourself. Silas did not blame Robert for this. You couldn't make a man want what he didn't want. The farm was Silas's, in every sense that mattered. But the farm, and everything around it, had changed enormously in the decade and a half before the summer of 1980, and not in ways that Silas found easy to make peace with. The changes had started in the mid-1960s, when a company called Consolidated Agricultural Resources, everyone in the county called it Cane Jerez, though almost no one could tell you what it stood for, had begun buying up land in Meade and Clark and Comanche counties. They hadn't been aggressive about it at first. They'd approached the families that were already in trouble, the ones who'd had a bad year or two and were sideways with the bank, and they'd make offers that were reasonable by the standards of the time. One family sold, then another, then another. By 1970, Cane Jerez owned 11,000 acres in a rough arc around the town of Harlan Creek, and they were farming it in a way that none of the old-timers recognized as farming. They called it precision agriculture, a term that had started appearing in the university extension bulletins and the pages of Farm Journal around that time. In practice, it meant the old concept of a farm as a living system, with its rotations and fallow years and hedgerows and careful attention to what the land could sustainably bear, had been replaced by the concept of a farm as a factory floor. You maximized input, you maximized output, you measured everything in per-acre yield figures, and you treated the soil as a medium for delivering chemical nutrients rather than a living community with its own logic and its own needs. The Nixon grain deal of 1972 had poured fuel on all of this. When the United States sold over $750 million worth of grain to the Soviet Union in what people had taken to calling the Great Grain Robbery, commodity prices shot upward overnight, and suddenly every acre of marginal land in the Great Plains looked profitable. The banks had lined up to lend money to anyone who wanted to buy more ground or upgrade equipment, and the equipment manufacturers had obliged by producing machines of a scale and complexity that would have seemed like science fiction to Dutch Holt, combined with air-conditioned cabs and AM/FM radios, tractors with 12-speed transmissions and hydraulic systems that could do in an afternoon what a man and team had needed a week for. Silas had bought some of this machinery, because you had to or you got left behind on price. His 1974 John Deere 4430 was the biggest tractor he'd ever owned, and he ran it hard every season, and it had served him well. But he'd watched his neighbors leverage themselves to buy even bigger machines and more land in the boom years of the mid-70s, and he'd watched the farm banks in Dodge City smiling at everyone who came through the door with collateral, and he had kept his own debt conservative in the way that Dutch Holt had always kept his debt conservative. Because Dutch Holt had watched men lose everything in the 1930s by owing money they couldn't pay when the margin turned thin. The most visible sign of the new agriculture was the center pivot irrigation systems. Silas had watched the first one go up on the old Morrison place in the spring of 1968, a quarter-mile-long aluminum arm pivoting slowly around a central well, dragging a line of sprinkler heads that could water a full 160 acres in a single rotation. It was, he had to admit, an impressive piece of engineering. Standing on the road at dusk watching it move, silver and slow against the orange Kansas sky, you could almost forget what it was actually doing. Pulling water out of the Ogallala Aquifer at a rate that the aquifer had not needed to deal with in the 10,000 years since the last glaciers receded and left it filled. His father had drilled a well in 1931, one of the first in the county, and had used it to water his livestock and his kitchen garden and a small field of sorghum through the worst years of the Dust Bowl. He'd pulled the water up slowly, with a pump driven by a one-cylinder gasoline engine that ran only a few hours a day, and the aquifer had scarcely noticed. In the spring of 1932, when everything else around them was dying, the Holt place had 2 green acres of garden that fed the family and fed several neighbors besides. Dutch Holt had not talked about this. He had simply done it. Now, in the summer of 1980, there were 23 center pivot systems running day and night across the 11,000 acres of Cane Jerez land, each of them drawing at a rate that would have made Dutch Holt put his hands on his hips and stare and eventually say, quietly, that it was not a good idea. Cane Jerez also ran 3 of what they called high-capacity turbine wells, essentially industrial pumps the size of a compact car, sunk 200 feet into the aquifer and capable of pulling 1,000 gallons a minute. The sound of them carried on the night wind, a low industrial throb that Silas had learned to recognize as he lay awake in his farmhouse. the sound of a place being used up. The Cane Jerez operation was run locally by a man named Gerald Paxton, who had appeared in Harlan Creek in 1974 with a company car, a gold Mercury Marquis roughly the size of a fishing boat, and a business card that said Regional Operations Manager, Consolidated Agricultural Resources Incorporated. Paxton was 45, wore sport coats too light for Kansas weather, had a degree in agricultural economics from Kansas State, and possessed the particular brand of confidence that comes from never having personally killed anything you needed to eat. He attended the Farm Bureau meetings and spoke about yield improvements and market positioning and soil testing protocols and all the other vocabulary of the new agriculture. A portion of the local farmers found him persuasive. A portion did not. The two portions had been gradually diverging for 6 years. Silas had never spoken to Gerald Paxton. He had attended 2 meetings where Paxton was present and had sat in the back row with his arms folded and listened and gone home. Whatever he thought about what he'd heard, he kept to himself. The drought of 1980 had been building for 2 years. The winter of 1978 to 79 had been short on snow, and the spring rains of 1979 had trailed off by early April, 6 weeks before they should have. The summer of 1979 had been dry enough to worry about, and Silas had spent that fall looking at his soil and his pasture grass and his creek, which had dropped to a trickle by September, and had known with the particular certainty of a man who has read the same land for 30 years that the next year was going to be worse. He had prepared accordingly. He reduced his cattle herd from 42 head to 26, selling off the animals in the fall of 1979 rather than trying to carry them through a dry year on short pasture. He planted his winter wheat conservatively, focusing his best seed on the fields with the heaviest soil that would hold moisture longest. He fixed every leaking pipe fitting in his irrigation system, replaced the pump on his stock well, and had his old hand-dug cistern cleaned out and ready. He laid an extra feed and stored it carefully. He had done what farmers have always done when they feel a hard season coming, prepared for the worst and hoped for better. The summer of 1980 arrived, and the worst showed up exactly as invited. The heat set in by the second week of June and simply stayed. The thermometer at the Harlan Creek feed and supply read 105 degrees Fahrenheit on 17 separate days in June and July. The national news, and Silas watched the CBS Evening News on his 19-inch RCA color television every night, sitting in Dutch Holt's old Windsor chair with a glass of well water, was full of reports from Dallas and Oklahoma City and St. Louis, where people were dying. The elderly in brick apartments without air conditioning, the poor, the very young. By mid-July, the national death toll had climbed past 1,000. The reporters stood in front of city fountains and talked about heat index numbers and the particular misery of humid heat, which was its own kind of suffering. In southwestern Kansas, it was different. The air was brutally dry, and the heat evaporated your sweat before it could cool you, and left your lips cracked and your eyes burning by 9 in the morning. The KRVN radio out of Lexington, Nebraska came through Silas's old Zenith table radio in the kitchen every morning at 5:30, the way it had for 20 years. Getting the market reports and the weather, the familiar voice of the farm broadcaster rolling out of the speaker while the coffee percolated. The reports were grim. Wheat yields across the winter wheat belt were down 40%. Corn was failing from Texas to Nebraska. The cattle markets were flooded as ranchers across the region liquidated herds they couldn't afford to water and feed, and the prices those ranchers got were terrible because everyone was selling at once. Carter's grain embargo against the Soviets, announced in January, had already knocked the bottom out of the futures market. People who had borrowed against the expectation of record prices were being squeezed from every direction simultaneously. And still it didn't rain. Day after day, the sky built clouds in the west by about 2 o'clock, the particular dark-bellied thunderheads that Silas had learned to read from childhood, the ones that in ordinary years meant you ran to get the hay in before the rain. And then they dissipated by 5, drifting apart and fading, spending themselves on lightning without a single drop falling. It was like watching someone reach for something over and over again and always come up empty. The air smelled of ozone every evening and nothing else. The shallower wells in the county started going dry in early July. Silas heard about it through the network of morning coffee conversations at the Harlan Creek Cafe, where he went twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, and sat at the counter with a cup of coffee and listened to what was being said. Ed and Marjorie Pemberton's stock well went dry on July 6th. The Vargas family on Route 7 lost their house well on July 12th and had to haul water from town in 50-gallon drums in the back of their Chevy pickup. Old Carl Heitzenroder's windmill well, which had never gone dry in 60 years of operation, not through the Dust Bowl, not through the dry summers of the 1950s, dropped below the pump intake by July 15th. Carl had stood at that windmill for a long time before he drove to town, and when he walked into the cafe that Tuesday morning and told what had happened, there was a silence at the counter that said more than most conversations. People got worried in the particular tight-jawed way of Plains farmers, the way they had during the Dust Bowl years, suppressing panic because panic was not productive, focusing instead on the practical steps, the arrangements that needed to be made, the extra miles to drive, the extra expenses to absorb, the quiet dignity of managing what could be managed and not wasting energy on what couldn't. The Cane wells kept running. The 23 pivots made their slow, relentless circles. The 3 high-capacity turbines thrummed through every night, and the cone of depression in the water table spread outward from the Cane fields like an invisible sinkhole pulling everything down toward it. The state of Kansas sent a geological survey team to Meade County on July 22nd, the hottest day of the summer, 107 degrees at noon, the air so thick and still that the cottonwoods along the dry creek bed had stopped moving entirely and just hung there looking exhausted. There were 4 of them, in 2 state-issue Ford Broncos painted the Kansas government green, and they set up at the County Road Department's gravel yard at the edge of town and began running tests with equipment that most people in Harlan Creek had never seen. An acoustic emission sensor on a tripod, something that looked like an oversized stethoscope attached to an amplifier, a survey transit, and a laptop computer, which was still a fairly remarkable object in a small Kansas town in 1980, the kind of thing you might encounter at the University Extension office in Dodge City, but not generally outdoors in a gravel yard. The team was led by a Dr. Warren Fitch, whose business card identified him as Chief Hydrogeologist, Kansas Geological Survey. He was perhaps 40 years old, fair-haired and slightly sunburned, carrying a clipboard and wearing a short-sleeved dress shirt that was already dark with sweat by 9 in the morning. He moved with the careful efficiency of an educated man used to delivering bad news to people he expected not to fully understand it. They spent 3 days testing, driving their green Broncos to various points around the county, driving metal rods into the ground at intervals, listening through their stethoscopic apparatus, entering numbers into their laptop, conferring over printed maps spread across the hood of one of the Broncos. On the morning of July 25th, Dr. Fitch called a public meeting at the Harlan Creek Community Center, which was a converted Legion Hall on the east side of Main Street. It smelled of old cigarette smoke and floor wax and was used for 4-H exhibitions, Farm Bureau meetings, and the occasional wedding reception where the dancing went late enough that someone opened the side door and let the country air in. Most of the farmers in the county came. They sat in folding metal chairs in their work clothes, chambray shirts, Wranglers, boots, and a few had come from their fields so recently they still had topsoil on their boots and wheat chaff in their shirt collars. Gerald Paxton sat in the front row with 2 men in similar sport coats who must have come up from Cane regional office in Wichita. Someone had set out a cooler of Pepsi and Mountain Dew in cans, cold, and a few people took one out of politeness, though most of the farmers had come in with their own coffee thermoses. Silas Holt came in 5 minutes before the meeting started and took a chair near the back wall and folded his hands in his lap and waited. Dr. Fitch was direct, which Silas appreciated even though he did not appreciate the content of what was being said. He put up a hand-drawn map on the corkboard at the front of the room, the county lines, the aquifer boundaries marked in blue, the Cane well locations marked with red X's, and explained, in the careful language of a man who has spent his career communicating hard facts to people who don't want to hear them, that the acoustic emission tests indicated a severely depleted aquifer. He used the phrase catastrophic drawdown. He said that based on current recharge rates, which in a drought year were essentially zero, and current extraction rates, the recoverable water in the shallow aquifer underlying Meade and Clark counties had been reduced by an estimated 85%. He said the deeper portions of the Ogallala aquifer, which normally provided a kind of reserve, had already been heavily drawn upon and showed anomalous pressure readings suggesting significant structural depletion. Then he said the sentence that settled into the room like a stone dropped into shallow water. Our assessment is that the recoverable aquifer in this region, at current extraction rates, is effectively exhausted. The room went quiet for a moment, that particular quality of silence that a large group of people produces when they've just been told something that amounts to a sentence. Then everyone started talking at once, the way farmers talk when the news hits the bone. Silas did not talk. He sat with his hands folded and looked at the map on the corkboard and thought about what he knew. What he knew was this. Beneath the Ogallala Aquifer, beneath the shallow water table that everyone in the county had been drawing from for 50 years, there were older rock formations. He had learned this from his grandfather, who had learned it from his father. His grandfather had called it simply the deep water, not with any mystical reverence, but as a descriptive term, the same way you'd say the deep roots about a cottonwood tree. There was the water up near the surface, in the sand and gravel deposits that everyone knew about and everyone drew from. And then there was the deep water, locked up in confined formations below the harder rock layers. Water that had been slowly accumulating in the cracks and porosity of limestone and dolomite for thousands of years, pressurized by the weight of everything above it, waiting. His grandfather had found water at 190 feet twice in his life, in wells that were essentially artesian, drilled through the hard cap rock, the pressure released, the water rising without pumping. Both of those wells had still been flowing in Dutch Holt's time, and Silas had drunk from one of them as a child on a summer morning that he could still recall with specific sensory clarity. Cold water from a tin cup, in the shade of a cottonwood, with the smell of freshly turned earth in the air, and his grandfather's hand resting briefly on his shoulder. Silas did not raise his hand during the meeting. When it was over, he stood up, put on his hat, and walked out into the 104-degree afternoon. On the drive home, he passed a Cane Jerez pivot that had been left running. Water was still arcing out of the spray heads, falling on corn plants that were clearly beyond saving. The leaves rolled tight in the heat, the color of manila envelopes. The water hit the baked soil and ran off the surface because the ground was too hard and hot to absorb it. Silas watched this for a moment through the dusty windshield of his Ford, then put the truck in gear and drove home. He ate supper alone, as he had eaten every meal alone for 3 years. Pork chops and green beans from the last of the canned goods Lorena had put up in the summer of 1977, before she got sick, and cornbread made from a recipe he'd memorized because she had never written it down, claiming the measurements were all in her hands, and you couldn't write down what was in your hands. He'd figured out his own version, which was close but not quite right in some indefinable way he'd stopped trying to define. After supper, he sat on the porch in the flat evening heat with a glass of water and watched the heat lightning walk around the southern horizon, and thought about his grandfather. August Holt had been a quiet and practical man, the kind of man who would have been considered mystical by people who believed practicality and mystery were opposites, but who would himself have been puzzled by that characterization. Water witching, to August Holt, was not more mysterious than reading the grass to know where the soil was deepest, or reading the bark of a tree to know which way was north, or reading the sky to know what tomorrow's weather would be. It was observation. The rods were not magic. They were instruments that made something observable that was already there, the way a barometer made air pressure observable, the way a plumb line made the vertical observable. What exactly they detected, whether some electromagnetic trace from water moving through deep fractures, or some subtle variation in the ground's conductivity, or the unconscious integration of a lifetime's surface observation translated into physical response. August didn't know and didn't need to know. They worked. That was enough. He'd shown Silas how to use them when Silas was 9 years old. A walk across the home quarter on a May afternoon, August's big weathered hands holding the 2 brass L-rods loosely at his sides, the horizontal arms pointing forward. Then the slow convergence as he approached the underground stream. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet crossing, like 2 old friends approaching the same point from different directions. You feel it before you see it, August had said. Something settles. Like when you find the right word. Silas had tried it himself that day, standing over the same spot where August's rods had crossed. He was 9 years old, not quite tall enough to hold the rods at the right height, but he'd felt something, or believed he had. The uncertainty of that memory had never fully resolved itself in 60 years. What he knew was that every subsequent time he'd tried, in his 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, he had found what he was looking for, and the wells drilled on his say-so had produced water. Whether that was the rods or the accumulated knowledge in his body of where water lived in this particular landscape, he genuinely didn't know. It didn't matter. He went into the equipment shed after dark, by the light of the bare bulb on the pull chain above the workbench, and took the rods down from their nails. They were simple things. 2 pieces of brass rod about 14 inches long, bent at right angles 3 inches from one end to form handles. The handles were wrapped in worn leather that August had put on them in the 1930s, dry and darkened now, but still holding. The long arms of the L were polished smooth from use and faintly greenish with oxidation. Silas held them loosely, one in each hand, the way his grandfather had taught him, the short handles resting lightly in the curl of his fingers, the long arms pointing forward in parallel. He thought about Dr. Fitch and his laptop computer and his acoustic emission sensor. He thought about Gerald Paxton's 23 center pivot systems. He thought about the Pemberton place and the Vargas family and old Carl Heizenroder's windmill. He thought about his grandfather marking a spot in the dry year of 1936, when the whole county was blowing away and the known wells were failing. August walking across the home field with these same rods, stopping on the west side of the low hill that nobody had ever paid much attention to, saying, "Here. Deeper than you want to drill, but it's here." Silas put the rods in the cab of his pickup, under the seat, and went to bed. He was up before for the next morning. He made coffee in the dark, drank it standing at the kitchen window watching the darkness outside, dressed in the same clothes he wore every day, faded Wranglers and a chambray shirt worn soft as flannel, his old Nakona boots that he'd resoled 3 times, and went out into the pre-dawn air. The pre-dawn was the only honest time in that summer. The temperature had dropped to the high 80s overnight, which was still too warm but cool enough that you could breathe without feeling you were breathing through a hot towel. There was a faint smell on the air of the creek bed, even though the creek had been dry since June. The smell of mud and willow and the ghost of running water that seems to linger in creek bottoms long after the water itself is gone. A nighthawk was working the last insects above the yard light, its crooked wings flashing briefly in the beam. He walked the home quarter first, the 160 acres where he'd been born and where he expected to die. He knew this ground with the intimacy that comes from walking it in every season for 7 decades. Knew where it was heaviest and where it lightened, where the old buffalo wallows had left circular depressions barely visible in the grass, where the sandstone ledge ran along the north side just below the surface, where his father had broken the walking plow in 1924 hitting a buried boulder that was probably still down there. He walked without the rods at first, just walking and looking, reading the ground the way his grandfather had taught him and his father had reinforced. Noting the plant communities, where the buffalo grass was thicker and a deeper green, suggesting more moisture in the subsurface, where the yucca grew in clusters, because yucca sends its roots down deep in search of water and knows where to find it, where the mullein stalks stood up tall and yellow-flowered, which August had always considered a sign of deep moisture. He read the cracks in the soil. The pattern of surface cracking tells you things about the soil's composition and substructure if you've been looking at it long enough. He read the angle of the slope, the drainage patterns, the places where the topography suggested some deeper structure influencing the surface. The west field, around the base of the low hill that nobody had paid much attention to in recent years, or rather, that no one had paid attention to in the modern way of noticing things, because August Holt had certainly paid attention to it, showed him something worth stopping for. The buffalo grass there was not quite as dead as it was everywhere else. Still brown, still summer dormant. But when Silas pressed his boot heel into it, and then lifted it, the grass had a slight resilience that the grass everywhere else didn't have, as if there was still some faint trace of moisture in the root zone. The yucca there was robust in a way that was slightly incongruous with everything around it. 2 large patches of it, standing up with a vigor that spoke of access to something the surrounding landscape didn't have. He took out the rods. He held them the way his grandfather had held them. Loosely, neutrally, no grip, just enough pressure in the curl of his fingers to keep them from falling. He walked slowly, placing each foot deliberately, heel first, the way you walk when you are listening for something with your whole body. Nothing for the first 100 yards. The rods stayed parallel, pointing straight ahead, the morning brightening almost imperceptibly in the east. He came around the east side of the hill, following the slight depression where the old Buffalo Trail had once come down from the north. The rods stayed parallel. A meadowlark started up from somewhere in the dry grass, that particular high clear song that has meant Kansas mornings for as long as there have been Kansas mornings, and Silas listened to it without stopping. He came around to the south side, where the hill flattened into a broad, gentle slope that Dutch Holt had always called this soft ground, meaning the topsoil there was a little deeper and a little darker than average, holding moisture better than the surrounding fields. In dry years, Dutch had always planted sorghum on the soft ground because it was the last to give up. About 40 feet from the hill on the southwest side, on a patch of ground that looked exactly like every other patch of ground in the immediate vicinity. A few clumps of dead cheatgrass, some dried mullein, the red-brown Permian soil cracked in the particular pattern it makes when it's been through 3 days of 105-degree heat. The rods began to move. Not violently. Not like in the movies, where the divining rod snaps down dramatically like something possessed. Just a quiet, steady convergence, each rod rotating inward on its own, the way a compass needle settles when you stop jostling it. Silas stood still and let them come to rest. They crossed each other at approximately a 30-degree angle, pointing down and inward. He stood there for a while. The sun was beginning to come up behind him, and the heat was already building at the horizon, and somewhere on the Conage operation to the north, one of the big turbine pumps started up. He could hear the distant low throb of it carried on the flat morning air, persistent and indifferent, like something that didn't know it was doing harm and wouldn't have cared if it did. He marked the spot with a piece of broken fence post he'd been carrying in his back pocket for exactly this purpose, drove it into the cracked soil with his boot heel, and walked back to the house. He found Don Mercer's number in the Meade County phone book, a thin pamphlet of a thing that fit in a shirt pocket, and called him at 7 in the morning. Don Mercer was 68 years old and had been in the well drilling business in southwestern Kansas since 1946. He operated what was probably the last working cable tool rig in the region, and he knew it, and he kept it running accordingly. The cable tool rig, also called a cable percussion rig, or a churn drill, or, among the older drillers who'd learned from men who'd come up before the rotary era, simply the walking beam, was technology that dated back to the 19th century, and by 1980 had been almost completely supplanted by modern rotary drill rigs, which were faster and more efficient across most formations. What the rotary rigs could not do as well, and this was the point, the specific and critical point, was penetrate extremely hard rock. Rotary bits wore down on rock of certain crystalline densities and could lose their purchase entirely on the deep Permian-era dolomites and dense limestones that underlaid the shallower aquifer zones in parts of southwestern Kansas. The cable tool rig worked differently, by brute percussion, lifting a heavy steel bit and dropping it repeatedly onto the rock face, chipping and pulverizing rather than drilling. A cable tool rig with a good experienced driller could go through rock that would stop or deflect a rotary bit entirely. Don Mercer's rig was a 1947 National 75, a steel-frame percussion rig mounted on a converted truck chassis, and it looked like something from a different century, which it essentially was. Don had been offered 3 times what it was worth by a collector of vintage machinery from Topeka, and had turned the offer down every time. He knew what that machine could do, and knowing what something could do was worth more than whatever price you could put on it. Silas Holt, Don said when he picked up the phone. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent 34 years listening to the sound of a cable tool rig working and had a corresponding gentleness in everything that wasn't a cable tool rig. Haven't heard from you in years. I need you to bring your rig, Silas said. A pause. How deep? Deep, Silas said. Probably past the cap rock. Maybe 180 feet. Maybe 200. Another pause. Don knew what that meant. Below the cap rock. Below the clay and sand and gravel of the Ogallala. Into the old rock. Into formations that the modern drilling surveys didn't bother much with, because the modern surveys were calibrated for the shallow aquifer and stopped looking when they'd found or not found what was there to find at that depth. You walked it, Don said. Yesterday morning. With the rods? Yes. A silence on the party line long enough that Silas could hear, faintly, the sound of another household somewhere down the wire. Someone in a kitchen, the distant clatter of a breakfast being made. Then Don said, "I can be there Thursday." Silas said, "Thank you, Don," which was more words in a single sentence than he usually deployed, and hung up. Word traveled fast in Meade County, as it always had and always would, through the mechanism of morning coffee at the Harlan Creek Cafe and afternoon conversations at the feed store and the exchange of information along the party telephone line, which still served about a third of the rural addresses in the county in 1980, though everyone who had it understood that anything said on a party line was essentially public information. By Wednesday evening, it was widely known that Silas Holt was planning to drill a well on the west side of his home quarter, below the unremarkable hill at the back of his property, using Don Mercer's antique cable tool rig, guided by the results of water witching with a pair of brass rods that had belonged to his grandfather. Gerald Paxton heard about this and responded with the kind of gentle, tolerant condescension designed to make its subject feel small without being directly confrontational. He mentioned it at the feed store on Thursday morning in a conversation overheard by 3 people who subsequently repeated it verbatim throughout the county. Old Holt's going to drill with his grandfather's dowsing rods. God bless him. You have to respect the attachment to tradition, even when the tradition is, scientifically speaking, completely discredited. 2 men at the counter. Neither of them Silas's neighbors, both of them younger men who'd come to farming in the boom years of the 70s and borrowed heavily to do it, had laughed in the way people laugh when they want to be on the right side of a thing. Dr. Fitch, the state hydrogeologist, was still in the county, staying at the Sagebrush Motor Inn on Route 56, completing his final report. He heard about Silas's plan and drove out to the Holt place on Thursday morning, arriving just as Don Mercer was pulling the National 75 through the gate on the flatbed truck. Silas was standing by the fence post marker when Fitch's state Bronco came down the dirt track from the county road. Fitch got out, squinting in the morning sun, and walked across the field to where Silas stood. He had his clipboard and a professionally sympathetic expression. "Mr. Holt," Fitch said, "I heard you were planning to drill. I came personally because I respect you and I don't want you to spend money on what I'm fairly certain is going to be a dry hole." Silas looked at him. "Our survey was quite thorough," Fitch continued. "The acoustic emission data is very clear about the state of the upper aquifer system." "What depth?" Silas said. "Did your sensors register to?" Fitch blinked. "The upper formation extends to roughly." "What depth?" Silas said again, quietly. "Did your sensors register to?" Fitch looked at his clipboard. "The equipment is calibrated for the upper formation, which extends to approximately 110 feet in this area." "I'm going past 110 feet, Silas said. Fitch paused. He had the expression of a man who is genuinely uncertain whether the person he's talking to is spectacularly ignorant or knows something he doesn't, and who doesn't have quite enough confidence in his own infallibility to dismiss the question entirely. "Mr. Holt, what's below the upper formation in this area is predominantly hard Permian age rock. There's not significant porosity. There are fractures," Silas said, "and in the fractures there is water." He said this without drama, without emphasis, the way you state something that is simply a fact. The sun comes up in the east. Water runs downhill. In the fractures there is water. Fitch looked at him for a long moment, then looked at Don Mercer's old rig being carefully positioned over the fence post marker. "I can't stop you," Fitch said. "No," Silas agreed. The cable tool rig was, by every modern standard, primitive. It worked by the simplest mechanical principle imaginable, a heavy steel bit at the end of a cable, repeatedly lifted and dropped. The percussion shattered the rock below. The cuttings mixed with water were removed periodically by a baler lowered on a secondary cable. It was slow. A rotary rig in the right formation could drill 100 feet in a day. The cable tool rig might make 40 feet on a good day, less through hard rock. But Don Mercer had been running this rig for 34 years, and he understood it the way Silas understood the land. Through intimate accumulated knowledge that was almost biological, a physical understanding that lived in his hands and in the specific quality of his attention when he listened to the rig work. He could tell from the sound of the cable, from the way the rig's crown block moved, from the rhythm of the bit's fall and rebound, what kind of rock he was in, how close he was to a formation change, whether the hole was staying plumb. He didn't need instruments for most of this. He needed the kind of concentrated attention that most people in 1980 were rapidly losing the ability to sustain. They started drilling at 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, the bit dropping through the cracked July soil with a methodical rhythm, the sound of it like a slow, patient heartbeat. By noon they were at 30 feet, through the topsoil and the sandy clay of the upper zone. Walt and Jean Breckenridge, brothers who farmed a section and a half about a mile east, drove over in their pickups and parked at the fence line and sat on their tailgates watching, drinking coffee from a thermos. They weren't saying anything negative. They were just watching, the way farmers watch things with genuine interest, reserving judgment, because you never really know until you know. By 3 in the afternoon, they were at 60 feet, and the cuttings coming up in the baler were changing color, going from the red-brown of the Permian surface soils to a deeper, almost maroon material that was older rock, denser, speaking of different geological time. Don squatted over the baler discharge and ran his fingers through the cuttings with an expression of focused professional attention, the same expression a good mechanic wears when he's listening to an engine. By the end of the first day, they were at 88 feet. No water. Gerald Paxton drove by in his gold Marquis on the county road and slowed to look, but did not stop. That evening, Silas sat on his porch again. He was not worried, which he found interesting as a fact about himself, the way you sometimes observe your own emotional state with a kind of quiet curiosity. He had been in situations that warranted worry. The Pacific, the bad years of the 1950s when prices dropped and the mortgage came due. The year Lorena had the first scare before the real sickness, and he knew what worry felt like, and this wasn't it. This was something closer to patience, the specific patience of a man waiting for something he is confident is there. He drank his well water and listened to the heat lightning in the south and thought about his grandfather standing at a pump on a morning in 1937, drawing up cold, clear water from 190 feet while the world around him was brown and blowing. Friday, the second day, Don Mercer arrived at 7 and had the rig running by 7:30. The Breckenridges were back at 8, and by 9, 4 more trucks had parked along the fence line. The Pembertons, whose stock well had been dry for 3 weeks. The Vargas family, who had been hauling water from town in plastic trash cans. 2 men from the east side of the county who'd heard about it from the feed store. Marjorie Pemberton brought a tin of oatmeal cookies and a fresh thermos of coffee and didn't say why she'd come, but she stayed. The bit went through increasingly hard rock through the morning. Don slowed the drilling rate at 90 feet, letting the percussion work, changing his bit at noon for a heavier one. The carbide tip tool designed specifically for high-resistance formations. The sound of the rig changed as they went deeper. A flatter, harder report when the bit struck, more metallic, the sound of steel on very old stone. At 95 feet, they hit what Don called the cap, a dense layer of dolomite running across portions of the county at varying depths, so hard it had stopped or deflected more than one rotary rig that had attempted to penetrate it. From above, the cap looked like the bottom of the world's aquifer to anyone whose instruments weren't designed to see past it. To a cable tool rig running a properly weighted bit, it was simply another obstacle. Don Mercer adjusted his cable length, increased the drop height, changed his rhythm, and kept going. Dr. Fitch had come back too, and was standing slightly apart from the farmers, his clipboard under his arm. He'd stopped writing on it. He was just watching. They drilled through the afternoon, slower now, methodical, the percussion of the rig steady and patient in the summer heat. The cuttings were coming up with increasing moisture, not saturated, but damp, and the moisture was increasing as they went deeper, a fact that Don noted with a glance at Silas and a slight tightening of focus in his expression, the look of a man who can feel what he's looking for getting close. At 6:15 in the evening, at a depth of 173 feet, the bit broke through into something it hadn't expected. Don felt it in the cable. The familiar resistance of the stone simply wasn't there on one drop. The bit fell fractionally further than the hole was supposed to go, a difference measured in inches, but unmistakable to a man who had been running this rig since 1946. He shut it down immediately and stood very still with his hand on the cable, the way a doctor stands still with his hand on a pulse he wants to be sure about. "There's a void," he said, very quietly, "or a fracture system. Something opened down there." He lowered the baler slowly on the secondary cable, and when he brought it back up, it was full of water, cold water, clear as glass. The kind of cold that doesn't come from a shallow formation in July, when the ground up near the surface has been baked for 2 months. This was cold from depth. cold from a darkness that the summer's heat had never touched, water that had been moving in slow silence through fractured limestone since before anyone now living was born, before their parents were born, before the first settler had broken the first acre of this ground. Don tipped the bailer over a coffee can, and they all looked at it. The water caught the last of the evening light and glittered. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Ed Pemberton put both hands over his face, and his wife put her arm around his shoulders, and nobody said anything about that either. They cased the well that evening and into the night, Don and Silas and Walt Breckenridge working by the light of 2 Coleman lanterns, setting the steel casing pipe into the hole and cementing the annular space. It was past midnight when they finished, the lanterns casting their yellow light across the dark field, the sound of the Conageres turbines still carrying on the night air from the north. At 4 a.m, Silas came back alone with a hand pump and set it on the casing head. The first pump strokes were tentative, the way the first strokes of a pump on a new well always are, pulling air, and then a cough of water, and then the real flow. It came cold and fast, and with a pressure that surprised him. Not quite artesian, not quite free-flowing without pumping, but close. The aquifer was under considerable pressure from above. You didn't have to pull hard. He let it run over his hands and looked at it in the moonlight. Then he sat down on the dry ground next to the pump and stayed there for a while. He was not a man who cried easily, and he didn't cry then. But he stayed there in the dark with his hand under the flow of the cold water, letting it run over the rope-veined back of his hand, and over the knuckles, and between the fingers, and he thought about his grandfather, who had found water in the same way on the same ground in the worst summer in living memory. He thought about his father keeping 20 acres of green garden alive during the years when the whole plains was blowing into the Atlantic Ocean, doing it quietly and without grandstanding, because the work was its own statement. He thought about the land itself, about what it owed you and what you owed it, about the difference between drawing on something and using it up, about patience and deep time and the particular kind of faith required to drill past 170 feet in a hard rock, because your grandfather's brass rods had crossed over a piece of ground that looked like every other piece of ground. He thought about Lorena, who would have come out here with him at 4 a.m. without being asked, and stood in the dark and understood perfectly why this mattered. The water was cold. He cupped his hands and drank. By the time the sun came up, the news had spread across Meade County. The party line was humming by 6 a.m, and by 8 o'clock there were a half-dozen trucks parked along Silas's fence line, and the drivers were standing at the well pump taking turns running their hands through the water and then looking at the water the way people who have been very thirsty look at water, with a kind of reverence that is also gratitude and also just ordinary animal relief, the particular relief of people who work with the land and know in their bodies what water means. Ed and Marjorie Pemberton filled 2 5-gallon galvanized buckets. Their 3 horses at home hadn't had fresh well water in 5 days. The Vargas family came with their pickup and 4 plastic trash cans. Old Carl Heitzenroder drove his 72 Chevy half-ton at about 25 miles an hour, the way Carl drove everything these days, and filled 6 milk cans that had been converted to water cans, and stood with his hands in his pockets looking at the pump like a man saying a prayer, except that Carl Heitzenroder had not said a formal prayer in 40 years and wasn't about to start now. Saying a prayer about a thing and having deep feelings about a thing were not the same, and Carl knew the difference. Dr. Fitch came out at about 10 a.m. and asked Don Mercer careful technical questions about the formation penetrated and the depth and the pressure, writing the answers in his clipboard notes. At one point he looked up at Silas, who was standing a few feet away, and said, "The fracture system you hit. I wouldn't have looked for it there. Our equipment isn't calibrated for that depth range. We were looking at the upper aquifer." "I know," Silas said. "How did you know it was there?" Silas thought about how to answer this. He thought about his grandfather standing on this same ground in 1936. He thought about the rods crossing over that particular spot on the southwest side of the low hill. He thought about what August Holt had said, not mysticism, just observation. The accumulated knowledge of where water lives in a specific landscape. He thought about 9-year-old boy standing over a spot in a May afternoon with a pair of brass rods held awkwardly in small hands, feeling something settle. "Experience," he said. Fitch wrote that down. Then he looked up again with an expression that suggested he'd thought of a follow-up question but had decided against asking it, which was perhaps the wisest thing he did that summer. The summer of 1980 eventually ended. They all end, even the ones that don't seem like they will. A formal complaint was filed with the Kansas Water Authority in August, signed by 23 landowners in Meade County, citing the depletion of the shallow aquifer by industrial-scale extraction and requesting a review of Connie Jerez's water rights allocation. The Kansas Water Authority investigation took 2 years, the pace at which regulatory investigations proceed, and eventually resulted in a reduction of Connie Jerez's permitted extraction rate and the installation of monitoring requirements that the company's lawyers successfully moderated to something less stringent than the original proposal. It was not a complete victory. It never is. But the turbine pumps ran at reduced output for the 2 years following, which allowed some recovery of the shallow aquifer, and 3 farm families who had been considering selling to Connie Jerez and moving to town decided to stay. Silas didn't attend any of the Water Authority hearings. He gave a written statement to the county attorney and went back to farming. The farm crisis of the early 1980s hit hard across the farm belt. Interest rates at 20%, land values collapsing, the debt-leveraged purchases of the boom years coming due at the worst possible moment. Silas had no leveraged debt. He had learned from his father, who had learned from the Dust Bowl, that you did not owe money you could not pay from a single bad year, because bad years came. The Holt farm survived the farm crisis the way it had survived the Dust Bowl and every other hard season, by not having overextended itself, by keeping its needs within what the land could reliably provide, by remembering that a farm was a relationship with a specific piece of ground and not a financial instrument. Gerald Paxton was transferred to a different regional position in the spring of 1982, whether for the Meade County water controversy or for other operational reasons Silas never knew and didn't particularly need to know. The Gold Mercury Marquis left Harlan Creek on a Tuesday morning in March and did not return. The center pivot systems kept running on the Connie Jerez land because the economics of the new agriculture didn't allow for contemplation, but they ran more quietly after that, at least for a while. Silas ran a 2-inch line from his deep well to the Pemberton stock tank, 200 yards across the fence line, with Ed Pemberton's labor and pipe fittings. He didn't charge the Pembertons for the water. This required no discussion. In the fall of 1981, he planted a kitchen garden for the first time since Lorena had died. He watered it from the deep well. The tomatoes that fall were better than anything he'd grown in 3 years. There is a knowledge that lives in the body of a man who has worked the same land for 50 years, a knowledge that accumulates not in the mind but in the muscles and the senses, in the particular way the foot feels the ground underfoot, in the sensitivity of the fingers to soil texture and moisture, in the eye's ability to read a subtle difference in the color of dry grass and know what it means. This knowledge is not mystical. It is empirical in the deepest sense, derived from experience, tested against results, refined over a lifetime. It is the original form of science, the science that precedes instruments. The tragedy of the late 20th century, as Silas Holt understood it without precisely those words, was not that the instruments had arrived, but that when they arrived people had used them as a reason to stop paying the older kind of attention. Dr. Fitch's acoustic emission sensors had told him what depth range to look at, and he had looked there, and he had found what was there to find at that depth, and had concluded that was all there was. He hadn't looked deeper because his instruments didn't go deeper, and he trusted his instruments more than he trusted any other source of information. August Holt's brass rods had no calibration range. They responded to whatever was there to be responded to, at whatever depth. Whether they worked through some mechanism of physical sensitivity, or through the unconscious integration of decades of surface observation into a physical response, or through something else entirely that science hadn't yet found a proper name for, Silas didn't know. But they had sent him to a spot on the southwest side of a low hill that nobody else had thought was significant, and at 173 feet, on a summer afternoon in 1980, the bit had broken through into a fractured limestone formation carrying cold pressurized water that had been waiting there in the dark for a very long time. The land had been trying to tell someone. Silas had known how to listen. In the fall of 1981, a young man named Tommy Breckenridge, 19 years old, grandson of Walt, the kind of young person who still had genuine curiosity left in him, came out to help with the wheat planting and asked Silas about the well. He asked about the dowsing rods. He asked whether Silas actually believed it worked or whether it was coincidence. or whether there was some scientific explanation that made sense of it. Silas thought about it for a moment, turning it over with the care he gave to anything worth thinking about. I think the rods do what your body already knows how to do, he said, if you've paid enough attention to the ground you're standing on. I think my grandfather paid attention his whole life, and the rods gave him a way to trust what he knew. Tommy thought about this. Then he said, "Can you show me how?" So one October morning, with the frost still on the dead grass and the cottonwoods yellow along the dry creek bed, Silas got the brass rods down from their nails and handed them to a 19-year-old boy and showed him how to hold them. Loosely, neutrally, no grip, and they walked the home quarter together. Silas told him what to look for in the plants and the soil and the way the ground felt underfoot, told him about the buffalo grass and the yucca and the quality of the soil cracks, told him about reading the slope and the drainage and the old buffalo trails that showed up in the grass if you knew what you were looking at. At some point on the southwest side of the low hill, the boy stopped walking. He looked down at the rods in his hands, and then looked up at Silas. "They moved," he said. "Did they?" Silas said, "I think so." Tommy was uncertain, the way you're uncertain the first time. The way Silas had been uncertain at 9 years old, standing over the same ground in a different decade. "That's the right way to feel about it," Silas said. "Keep paying attention." They walked back to the house for coffee, and the rods went back on their nails, and the morning went on the way mornings do. The work waiting, the ground quiet under the October sky, the deep water far below moving in its slow, cold, pressurized darkness, as it had been moving since long before the first man ever stood on this land and looked down at it and thought about what might lie beneath. Silas Holt was still farming that land in 1985, in 1987, in 1990, walking it before dawn the way he always had, reading it the way his father had read it and his grandfather before that. He still listened to the KRVN Farm Report every morning on the old Zenith. He still watched the CBS Evening News in Dutch Holt's Windsor chair. He still drove the county roads slowly enough to see what the land was telling him through the window, and when it told him something important, he acted on it. He had the rods on their 2 finishing nails inside the shed door. He had the knowledge in his hands and his feet, and his 70-plus years of paying attention to one particular piece of ground. He had the deep well on the southwest side of the low hill, which still ran cold and clear as the day Don Mercer's bit broke through into the dark, and from which the cattle drank, and from which the garden was watered, and from which, on hot summer evenings, Silas sometimes drew a glass and held it up to the window light before drinking it. The way his grandfather had held up a glass of well water in 1936, the year the whole world was blowing away, and had said, quietly, to no one in particular, "The ground keeps its water if you know where to ask." The rods were still on their nails. The knowledge was still in his hands. The water was still there, in the dark below everything, waiting for someone who knew how to find it.